Sadly, there is no anthem today, so we will continue by reading from the 16th chapter of Matthew. Listen again for the word of the Lord. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. This too is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Because I am not known to be someone who likes to do things the easy way, and I knew going into seminary that I'd have to take both biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew, I decided to get a head start on seminary, so starting in the summer instead of the fall with Greek. Now, I had spent 8 years between high school and college learning German, which is not the easiest language to learn, so I figured, biblical languages, I got this. Now, the first verb we learned during the first week of summer Greek was luo. Luo is a regular verb, which means it doesn't take on any crazy endings or do any funny conjugations when you use the verb. And the translation of luo is to destroy or to loose. Now, I had knowledge of the New Testament when I started seminary, and I could not think of a singular instance in which someone loosed something. But I did my duty and I learned how to conjugate it, and luo actually marked the start of a really crazy summer where I learned a lot, made friends I still have today, and I decided not to be a scholar in biblical languages. So most of my reading about this passage focused on a fancy churchy term that's called apostolic succession, particularly as it relates to the Catholic Church. So what that fancy term means is that the Catholic Church has used this passage to say that Simon Peter was really kind of like the very first pope. And so all the other popes since him have come from the same line. So the spiritual authority of the Catholic Church can be traced all the way back to Peter, who was one of Jesus' disciples. Now, we, as Reformed Protestants, have separated from this idea and the whole concept of a pope. But the current pope can trace his history back to Peter. And whether you believe in the authority of a pope or not, that's pretty impressive. But rather than get hung up on a pope, luo, to loose something, kept sticking in my mind. Mostly because it shows up twice in this passage in Matthew. Jesus tells Peter, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose, luo, on earth will be loosed, luo, in heaven. So I am of the opinion that the church, capital C, is in the middle of another Reformation. The first one was in 1517, which is exactly 500 years ago, and it started with Martin Luther. He looked at the church practices of the time, decided ways that it could be made better, and he put his nose to the grindstone and made it happen. At least that's the Reformation in a very small nutshell. And I kind of think that's where we are in history right now. So if you think back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, this is the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the church was more than a church. It was a community center, a social hall, a place to network and make friends. It was the social center of the community. But recent studies have shown the downside of that. And that is that the social aspect of the church became more important than the spiritual aspect of the church. So people showed up to socialize, and if they got a little bit of God in between, well, that was good enough. And I don't mean to criticize it, especially if you grew up in the church during those decades. But if you look at it through today's lenses, we are so far away from that now, and I think on that we could all agree, we're so far away from it that it's not even funny. Because if you ask the millennial generation what they want in church, most will tell you they don't think it's very important to attend a weekly worship service. The generation that's growing up right now wants to see the church at work, outside the doors, and in the world. And the millennials have proven that they will show up for that. And if you couple that with the fact that many people nowadays see the church as being hypocritical, sort of a do as I say, not as I do kind of thing, then it gets even worse. And that's why it's all the more important for the church to begin to luo, to begin to loosen. Now, in order to loose something, you must have something bound together. So instead of what used to be, instead of a church building or location being the thing that binds the community together, I think that's what it's time for us to loose. Now, I realize the irony of me saying that while our new church is being built a few miles away, but hang in there with me here. You've heard me say before that the people are the church, not the building. And we have Jesus right in the scripture passage saying, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." So the church, the initial church, the first church, was built not in this special location designated by God, or with these special previously consecrated materials from this really rare and special place. The church was built on a person. And so building our church and the church, capital C, on people instead of a building is scripturally based. So it's time to loose the idea that the church is defined as a community center, a social hall, a place to network. Fellowship is important, and I realize sometimes we do come to church just to hang out with people that we know and like, and that's okay. We all do that. But if we want to have these young families with kids that everyone likes to talk about, if we want to be a home for the millennial generation, then we've got to loose or luo this idea that, well, they know where we are, they know when we worship. If they want to be here, then they'll come. We've got to get outside our doors and make a name for ourselves in the community. A park cleanup, an after-school program, social justice work, peace vigils, participating in interfaith events, welcoming people who are different than us, and the list goes on. I said last week that there are any number of causes in the world that need money and volunteer support. So maybe your passion isn't homelessness or hunger or equal rights. That's okay. You don't have to be passionate about everything that crosses your path, because you'll get exhausted really quickly if you try. But do some discernment work and figure out what's meaningful to you. Session has been working this summer on finding things that our church as a whole is passionate about. We've been listening to try and discern where God is calling us to and what issues God is calling us to help with. Because while we need choir members and ushers and people to set up tables and chairs in the social hall, it's not the heart of who we are and what we do. So I'm asking you, because I don't know, how can we be the hands and the feet and the voice of Christ in this world, in this valley, with each other? What are the needs here in our community that are underserved? How can we focus on things that don't just involve writing a quarterly check so that we feel like we've done our Christian duty? Though as Presbyterians we don't have a pope, our church is also built on Peter, the rock and the foundation that Christ set out and designated for us to be built upon. And Peter was not perfect. Peter was just as flawed and as broken as we are. But Peter was willing to luo. Peter was willing to bind and to loose things on earth so that they could be bound or loosed in heaven. So what are we going to luo? What are we going to let go of? Not so that we can attract certain demographics of people, not so that we can grow our membership, not so that we can justify having spent all this money on building a new church. What are we going to loose so that God can continue to build the church on us, just as Christ built the initial church on Peter?